Good day to all of you. I am speaking to you from Belmont, Massachusetts, outside of Boston, and it is a great pleasure to be here. I understand that there are more than 250 people registered for this session from more than 30 nations, which is just outstanding and a tribute to the interest that there is around the world in indigenous wisdom and in doing good conservation in partnership and with the leadership of indigenous peoples from around the world. Our facilitator today is Cecilia Riebel. She has done a really outstanding job at digging into this area of practice and policy. Cecilia is the regional representative of the International Land Conservation in Australasia and a great colleague to work with. So Cecilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jim. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today. I'm really proud to be representing the ILCN in hosting this webinar today on Indigenous-led conservation. And in particular, really looking forward to drilling down into this question around how traditional land management is driving conservation outcomes on private lands across the globe. As Jim mentioned, we've got many registrants from many countries, which is wonderful. And I invite you all to introduce yourselves in the chat, which organisation you work with if relevant, and of course, which cultural lands you're dialing in from. For myself, I am dialing in from the cultural lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, located in Melbourne or Naarm, southeastern Australia. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to all First Peoples joining us here today. I'd also like to acknowledge First Nations people throughout Australia and the world, recognising their deep connections to land, sea and community. In Australia, that connection and stewardship knowledge spans back more than 60,000 years. I think it's also important in this space to acknowledge that I, along with all non-Indigenous peoples, have benefited greatly from the many hundreds of generations of land management and stewardship by First Nations peoples. Working in this sector that seeks to recognise and protect our incredible natural values in our landscapes is a privilege, and in no small part thanks to that Indigenous stewardship. And also, I think it's important to say that the conservation movement has benefited both knowingly and unknowingly from the historic persecution and displacement of Indigenous peoples. And part of the inquiry today, I think, is to ask ourselves, what do we do about this? And how can we avoid perpetuating these wrongs and instead, work towards a different kind of future, maybe one that thinks about conservation and land management and access in whole new ways. So those who joined our webinar last month on this theme, welcome back. You'll recall that at that session, we looked at how the conservation sector could build better partnerships with traditional owner groups. And we learned that this process, would really require a cultural shift, a change in mindset around embracing careful listening, building trust for strong relationships, resourcing effectively, and bringing a different relationship to time in how we manage our projects, our relationships, and our ongoing work. And today, we're actually really getting on ground. We're looking at ways that Indigenous-led conservation is transforming our land management approaches and outcomes. At a practical level, we're going to look at what some of those approaches might look like, what uses and values are being prioritised for protection, but also, I think, stepping back a little from that level of detail, looking at what actions and attitudes might be needed to achieve those outcomes, and critically then, what mainstream conservation organisations can learn from these insights. So I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of really inspiring speakers today from Australia, New Zealand, and the US. I'm going to introduce them as we go along. And once again, I encourage you to ask questions in the chat so that we can enjoy a rich discussion after the presentations. So we're going to start with our Australian contingent. And I say contingent because we've got a few participants. So it's going to be a little different to a standard presentation. We're going to hear a pre-recorded interview from Renee Sweetman, who's a Bunurong traditional owner and unfortunately was unable to join the panel, but was very keen to contribute. So Renee was involved in one of the first land handbacks in Victoria at a place called Rill on the Mornington Peninsula. That property was one of Trust for Nature's very first conservation covenants and had been managed by committed non-Indigenous land managers for many decades. And the most recent owner handed that property back to Trust for Nature, who in turn worked with local traditional custodians to transfer that land. So we're going to hear from Renee on some of her reflections and feelings about that experience. And then we're going to hear from Marissa Williamson-Pullman, a proud Ngarrindjeri woman, about some of the practical cultural land management actions that are happening on ground at Rill, in conversation with Ben Cullen, who is a regional manager from Trust for Nature. Ben is a non-Indigenous representative on this panel and for the conservation sector. And Ben, I think for anyone who knows him, I think it's fair to say he's quietly and sensitively been leading the way on progressing traditional animal rights long before it became a mainstream idea. Listening and building relationships and finding ways to build capacity for TOs. So without further ado, let's play the video and then I look forward to a conversation between Marissa and Ben. Thanks.
First of all, I just want to say thanks so much for having us here. We've got a cup of tea, have a little chat about conservation and First Nations land management. Is there anything you'd like to say before we get started?
Yeah, I think that I would love to start off by saying that our sovereignty has never been ceded. These lands and waters were never sold. So this will always be Aboriginal land.
So first of all, I want to say thanks for having me, and it's a huge honour to be here on your country with you. I want to acknowledge your elders, both past and present, and also acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded in Australia. So thank you so much for having me here. It's a huge honour.
Thanks for being here.
I thought the first question might be, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Renee Sweetman and I'm a Bunurong and Aotearoa woman. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on my country, Bunurong country, and I would like to pay my respects to my elders, past and present.
In your perspective, why is it important for First Nations people to be involved in caring for country?
I think because it is a part of our customs, it's a part of our law, and I think to have that taken away from you is essentially a form of cultural genocide. If we're not able to do that, then we're not able to fulfill our responsibilities, and also we're not able to pass that on to the next generation as well.
What sort of an impact does removing cultural practices have on the land itself?
Massive. It's massive on so many levels. Firstly, you'll see it ecologically, but also spiritually as well. I think that everything is connected, and if you take something away, there's always going to be consequences for that, and I think that's a part of what we're seeing today.
You personally have been involved in some land, the management's being handed back, and the ownership zone of. What's been your personal journey in being a part of that?
Well, I think for me, that was such a highlight. I think I started my course, land conservation and management course, and then we met, and yeah, you started telling me about the real property, and I was really interested in what you had going on, what your plans were, and then yeah, I think it was a journey. I think that's what really made it. Yeah, it's kind of hard to explain, but it was a journey, and to be a part of that, to know what that kind of consists of, or what that yeah, I'm really thought about it too. Now that I look back, it's like, yeah, it was a beautiful process.
I guess what's been a big thing for us doing that land that we've in the process of handing back. Now Bunurong has a land management team that's doing work out there, and I know I've said humbled a few times, but I've been humbled again to see how much more progress they've made in the property in terms of managing it in a short period of time. You've played part in working in land management as well yourself. Did you have any big feelings about being out there on country and doing that work when it's right in the soil and stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know, it was just a beautiful feeling to be out there with the rest of the crew. Yeah, there was so much pride in it, if that makes sense. Like, knowing that if we do one thing on the property, that it's going to affect the rest of everything. Even like taking some of the fences down, we're like, I'm so excited to see what is going to happen because of that. You know, it's yeah, it was a really beautiful and what's the word I'm looking for?
I'm trying to think.
Like, what's the word?
Connecting?
Yeah, but also like gives you like strength, not strength, but what's the word?
Empowering?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I think it was really empowering.
What are your thoughts about connecting with other First Nations people around the world who are doing land management? Do you think it's an important thing to connect up?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because I don't know a lot, but some of the things that I've heard is that, you know, we're facing a lot of the same struggles, and to be able to share that knowledge and share, you know, something that might have worked for them, or a different way of thinking that we could adopt. Just trying to navigate the colonial space, basically. It's a hard job. Yeah, and I just know that there's so much knowledge out there. They would, yeah.
So you see allyship as an important role in
It's essential. It is essential. We need allies, nationally and internationally. I feel like there's so much value in coming together, in understanding one another, in creating that change together.
Hello everyone, I'm Ben Cullen, who's just in the video there. I've got to say, working in this space, I get to come across the most amazing, strong people, strong minds, strong voices, and it's been an absolute privilege to work with people like Renee. They say us Australians are slow speakers, so some of you might be picking that up from the video, but it's been such an amazing chance to get to learn from traditional owners through this process. As a straight person, straight up ecologist, I learnt a very Western version of science, and I've gone through the process of relearning and learning from traditional owners over many years now, and it's been so fruitful, and the environment's better off for it, I can definitely say. I want to acknowledge the Bunurong people and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, because I'm coming through from Bunurong country down here in the Mornings Peninsula, and also pay my respects to elders all over the world who are tuning in for this. And as I'm speaking about strength, I want to introduce Marissa Williamson. She's got all types of strength. I can really see her as time's moving on, she's achieving big things over time, and it's been an absolute pleasure to watch her journey. On top of her impact in the land management space and her experience there, she's also a two-time Australian boxing champion, Australian Hall of Fame scholarship award winner, and yeah, she's also played AFLW and all sorts of things. On top of that, she's been working in the land management space. So I just want to introduce Marissa there today. How are you going, Marissa?
I'm good. How are you, Ben?
I'm good. I'm good. Would you mind giving us a short personal introduction about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Marissa Williamson Pullman. I just like to acknowledge that we're meeting from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Gurni Nation. Well, I am, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'd like to just extend that acknowledgement to First Nations people all over the world. So yeah, I'm a proud Ngarrindjeri woman, and I kind of fell into land conservation and management by accident. I was freshly 18. Melbourne was the most locked down city in the whole world. Job opportunity came up, and it was to get out into the bush and be a ranger. And I thought, why not? Sounds like a great idea. We had a 5K radius at the time, so we couldn't even leave within 5 kilometers from our house. So for anything that wasn't essential. So yeah, it was for a First Nations ranger team, Narrip Rangers, and that ended up being an opportunity to go into a Cert 3 in land conservation and management with Trust for Nature. And God, I just at the time I just didn't even dream of what that decision would have done for my life and for my future. And I grew up in foster care, so I had 16 foster placements in 5 years, and I was taken from my mother at the age of 9, so my Aboriginal mother at the age of 9. So I didn't understand, I didn't know what my place was in the Victorian Aboriginal community, and I didn't understand my place in caring for country business, but I soon found out doing my Cert 3 in land conservation and management, which was designed for and by Aboriginal people, and that's why it's done so well. And it has been going for a number of years now. So, and since that opportunity, I've exchanged culturally with mob from all over the state and all over Australia, but also from all over the world too, which is, I didn't think in a million years that would be the case. And yeah, since that ranger role and really learning and immersing myself in the Woi-wurrung culture and being culturally adopted by Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung, I've gone on to become Agriculture Victoria's very first Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Officer. So that's huge. 90% of cultural heritage in Victoria is on private land. So that was a massive deal Victorian mob. And then, yeah, going on to my second role as Heritage Policy Officer within First People State Relations, and their role is to administer the Aboriginal Heritage Act. So yeah, it's been an amazing journey, and I'm just so happy to be here.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, one question I think would be really relevant to today would be, how do you think private landholders and land trusts could help support Indigenous people, maybe in the Australian context, but perhaps around the world as well?
There's two sides of the coin to this, and I think it's, you know, giving First Nations people access to the property, but also it's also a birthright to have access to country. So just knowing that as well, it's giving access it's paying the rent. That, you know, and you know how First Nations people manage their land and practice their culture on that land is their business, and it's their birthright. And I think if, you know, trusts are going to give that land back, it's just them paying the rent, really.
And do you think, are you able to give us some examples of some cultural heritage that we need to protect that in the Australian context? At
the moment, the Victorian government, we're going through major amendments to the Aboriginal Heritage Act this year. It's a very white way of looking at what cultural heritage is. For First Nations people, cultural, it's non-lateral. Everything is connected. You know, the soil, the water, the sky, the animals, everything is intrinsically connected. Even the people, like Uncle Dave Wandon, classic. You know, healthy land, healthy people, vice versa. You know, mob need country, country needs mob. So yeah, I don't know if I rambled on a little bit there, but
oh, that's great. I've got just to share some pictures from the course that you did as part of the work, and it's about bringing First Nations people out onto country. I'll just flick through a couple of the pictures. Would you care to comment on any of that work, Marissa? I
mean,
you armed with a chainsaw.
I think, you know, as someone, you know, the Aboriginal experience is, you know, living off country most of the time, not feeling very connected, not feeling very empowered as an Aboriginal woman. Like, but here I was just, you know, I just felt so empowered to, you know, feel like I had a place in caring for country. And there's me there. Uncle Ian taught me he taught me the story of his Bunurong art, and he allowed me to put it on that planter box there for the Murnong, which is a women's business plant. And we still have these seeds, these Murnong seeds, and we're still trading them. I'm still trading these Murnong seeds from years ago when we planted these. But yeah, this was me and Renee, just my sister girl, and it was, yeah, we've just made friends for life from just being out on country and caring for it. This was Shane. This was his first ever welcome smoking that he was got the cultural authority to do by his dad, who was an elder. So I was blessed to have been smoked by him on his country. It was an amazing, yeah, it brought tears to my eyes. It was awesome. It's amazing. But yeah, the course, the governance is, you know, it's designed for Aboriginal people by Aboriginal people, and that's just why it just continues to work. And we continue to be supported by allies, real allies, not people appropriating change culture. Like Ben would walk off, you know, from time to time, because he was holding that space for us to learn and have access to eldership without, you know, white people taking up too much space. So yeah.
And thanks for sharing that. Do you also think conservation covenants can play a role in protecting cultural heritage?
Yeah, because conservation covenants kind of, it covers more than just the tangible, you know, the artifact scatters, the scar trees. it's the cultural values of the site that matter. Like you'd learn from speaking with, especially someone like Renee, who is so emotionally and spiritually connected to her country, that, the practice of being out on country and taking care of it and exchanging that energy with it, and seeing, monitoring it over time to see what comes back to that site, like that just makes us get up every morning. Like it just, yeah, it's more than just the archaeological values of it. It's but also, like, from my point of view, if you're having great relationships with these covenants, like conservation covenants, like, why can't we have that conversation with the landowners? You were so willing to put this conservation covenant on it. Well, why can't you give access to Aboriginal people as well to manage it?
Absolutely, that's some great points, and it's knowledge like this that you're passing on that really helps us think about the context of this stuff, and really has a practical element that we can start to look at how we can bring into the picture. So thank you for sharing it. I think we're going to save some questions for you in the panel talk coming up shortly. I will just, as I see the Q&A, I'll just give a shout out to the Chilean National Day for Indigenous Peoples. I just saw pop up as well. So huge respect from Australia over to you guys. And thanks, Marissa. And thanks, Renee, who's not here, but hopefully will listen later. And I'll pass over to you, Cecilia, for the next part.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Marissa. And in our absence, thanks, Renee. That was really wonderful. So many threads there, so many wonderful ideas, and such inspirational young women leading the way around some of these really important issues. I'm going to introduce Lily Middleton now. Lily is the program coordinator for Kiai Mahe for Nature for Karapo in an Indigenous-led restoration project in Christchurch, New Zealand. She's going to speak about this project, which is aiming to recloak the land in native bush to revitalise bird populations, restore the land function as a food source, using land management approaches. Lily is of New Zealand, European and Maori descent. She was raised with Maori customs and values and continues to have a strong connection to her Indigenous ancestry. Thanks, Lily. Over to you.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Ko mātiti te maunga, ko waiweka te awa, ko matatua te waka, ko tūhoi me te whanau apanui, me te whakatōhia o kuiwi, ko ngatiira te hapu, ko Opekiro te marae, ko Middleton, Wicksteed, Wehe te whānau, ko Lily taku ingoa. Hello everybody, my name is Lily Middleton, and I am of New Zealand, European and Māori descent. Māori are the Indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we introduce ourselves by presenting a condensed version of our whakapapa or genealogy, which acknowledges the ancestral lands and waters from which we descend. So I am of the Mātiti Mountain, the Waiaweka waters, and tribes Tūhui, Te Whanau Apanui and Whakatōhia. In Māori culture, humans share whakapapa or lineage with every living and non-living thing, which provides a sense of interconnectedness to the natural and elemental world. For this reason, Māori do not only see themselves as on the land, but of it, and our relationship to the land is defined by deep spiritual and cultural significance above its value as an economic resource. All of this to say, I have not always worked in conservation, but I have always been Māori. So my environmental awareness and obligation to protect natural resources is embedded in my cultural identity. Next slide, please. So today I'm dialing in from Ōtautahi, Christchurch, Aotearoa, New Zealand. And as Cecilia said, I am the program coordinator for the Kaimahi for Nature Whakaropo project, which is an Indigenous-led restoration project based in Whakaropo, Littleton Harbour. So this project is started as an employment scheme. Well, it was an employment scheme, which kind of exists to solve two problems. So it came about after the COVID pandemic and aimed to sort of solve some of the issues that we were having with unemployment, as well as helping to restore some of the impacts of climate change on the environment. So the Kaimahi for Nature Whakaropo project is one of the biggest in the South Island of New Zealand, and I work in that space for Te Hapu o Ngāti Wheke, which is a sub-tribe or smaller community within the larger Ngāi Tahu iwi. So the way that this project is structured is it is a three-way partnership between Te Hapu o Ngāti Wheke, which is where I work, the indigenous-led, and we are partnered with two non-Indigenous organisations. So Conservation Volunteers New Zealand and the Living Springs Trust. Through this project, the aim is to restore the whenua or the land through native plantings, invasive pest and weed control, as well as fencing and track building and all the usual kind of maintenance. Next slide, please. This the way that the project is set up, this partnership that we have is really it's the first thing of its kind that I've been a part of, and it's pretty phenomenal to get to go to work and participate in active equitable partnership. And here's my project. So we have two teams based in 3 primary locations and 9 supplementary sites around Littleton Harbour. So the pictures that you see here are on the Māori land. So we have Māori reserve land as well as Māori land blocks that we are aiming to restore right now. So within this project, we collaborate with a lot of non-Indigenous organisations, including corporate businesses, local community-based sort of volunteer groups, universities, research institutions, and this sort of collaboration looks like consultation with landowners, sharing knowledge from both sides of the camp, providing jobs for local people, and really ultimately listening and learning. To me, equitable partnership with non-Indigenous organisations looks like finding common ground and shared values and aspirations, really digging into the why that you're doing the work in the environment that you're doing. I remember when I first came onto this project, which was 2 years ago, it's a 3-year project, I was talking to the chair of the Living Springs Trust who helped us deliver the outputs for this project. And we were, immediately we discussed the why. Why I asked, why are you doing this? And he said the same thing to me. And I came at it from a Māori perspective. The answer was simple when it comes to fulfilling these restoration outputs. We were aiming to recloak native bush, bring back the birds, and provide future generations with that which will sustain them. And when I was kind of discussing this with Dennis, he had the exact same idea. He said, that's exactly why we're doing what we're doing. And I remember saying, that's te ao Māori. the Māori way of life, we want the same things. So after we had established the why, the how followed shortly after. So collaboration is, to me, in these spaces, consideration and respect for cultural values coupled with tangible follow through. And I guess, what that means pretty simply is anyone can talk the talk, but walking the walk and having sort of consistent, meaningful follow through that is beneficial to the Indigenous people that you're consulting with is incredibly important, and it's the only way to sort of build trust through these partnerships. For example, we have sort of ongoing pig cults on the peninsula, so in some of the neighbouring properties around where we work, and we, being the local group of Indigenous people, were approached by the organisation who was fulfilling the pig cults. What they wanted basically was to make sure that the methods that they were using for this practice aligned with tikanga or Māori custom, and that it was appropriate in this space on this land that was and is historically mana whenua or Indigenous. So yeah, they came to us and they said, is what we're doing suitable for this land, and are you okay with it? To which we went back and forth and we shared some kind of approaches that could be taken, and eventually said, yeah, that's absolutely fine. It was ethical and sustainable, and it aligned with our worldview. And so that would have been enough, and that would have been quite nice, just on a collaboration point of view. But what they did after that was, following the cows, they offered the meat to the local hapu, to the Māori community, to help and sustain them. So it's that kind of yes, consultation, discussions, but then follow through, which can have a meaningful impact. Next slide, please. So this. So Mātauranga Māori. So this project is guided by Māori principles and values that we've found really add to the project and help us achieve our goals and aspirations for the land. So we use principles such as kaitiakitanga, which refers to guardianship, and it's sort of the innate obligation that Māori people have to protect and foster thriving environments in the natural space. So kaitiakitanga is one of the leading principles that we use. We also, as I mentioned, and as I think Marissa mentioned parallels to previously, sort of all work that we do within this project is guided by, this idea of interconnectedness. So it's guardianship, kaitiakitanga, as well as interconnectedness. And the way that we frame that when discussing this project is through a phrase, ki uta ki tai, which literally translates from the mountaintops to the sea. It refers to the journey of wai, or water, as it falls down from the sky, flows over the land and makes its way out to sea, which basically describes a Māori understanding of sustainable land management, where each part of the ecosystem has a relationship to the other and nothing can be separated. This idea of complete interconnectivity between natural resources is what motivates us both on the field and when considering the wider impact of this project. So in short, anything that we do on the land has a direct impact on the water, and the overall aspiration is to see both of those resources thrive. Yeah. With regards to mātauranga Māori knowledge, it really is the foundation of the work that we do. And we've had a really, rewarding opportunity to spread that knowledge between a lot of the Indigenous organisations that we work with. And we've been able to find sort of a common ground where mātauranga is both applicable and can be used in conjunction with Western science. So that manifests in biodiversity monitoring, particularly. So yeah, using both mātauranga and Western science to determine the health of the ecosystems that we work within. Now this looks like talking to the kaumātua or elders about what came before. I think when we discuss, the flora and fauna and bird populations and lizard populations that existed on the land as they knew it in their time, we can stand in the present day and look around and see what's missing. And from that, we can then plan forward. Okay, what do we need to infill? What do we want to see returned, restored, and really revitalized? And then how can we use Western science to help achieve those goals that we have? In short, science proves what mātauranga knows. It's intentional, it's a bit slower, and it asks, how did we get here, before considering where are we going to next. Mātauranga considers the social aspect of restoration. How might the work being done today sustain the generation of tomorrow? Really coming back to that interconnectedness. Next slide, please. Cool. This is.
Lily, sorry, I'm just going to interrupt. If we could just wrap up in the next minute or so, that'd be great. We can.
No problem.
We can have more questions in panel. Thanks.
No worries. Well, luckily, this is my last slide. Just very quickly, this is a piece of paper that I stole from my team that are based in the field. And this is how they decided to frame their vision, frame their why. So this is completely based in mātauranga Māori, and it inspires them to achieve the work today. So recloaking the whenua and native bush, revitalising the bird populations, and restoring the mahinga kai, the ability for the land to function as a food source. So yeah, I think I can stop here. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Lily. I could listen to you all day, but we've got so much to fit in. Thanks so much for that presentation, and I'm sure we're going to expand on some of those ideas in our discussion. Our last panelist is Hawk Rosales, and we would be literally here for the rest of this webinar if I introduced him fully and appropriately. He is an Apache Indigenous land defender and consultant from the US who has worked for many, many decades with tribes and conservation organisations to drive initiatives that are going to protect and restore, but also return Indigenous peoples' traditional lands and waters to them. Notably, for more than 30 years, he directed the Intertribal Sinkyone Wilderness Council, which was a consortium of tribes looking to re-establish traditional land tenure in that landscape. From producing documentaries on the protection of Indigenous land and waters to co-leading tribal efforts to establish an extensive network of marine protected areas along California's coastline, to developing culturally focused conservation easements. I'm not sure there's much that Hawke hasn't done. And I really love the arc. I really love that we started this conversation with young, strong Indigenous women, and we're ending it with a deep wisdom coming from Hawke. And I really look forward to hearing some of your reflections. Hawke, thanks. Over to you.
Thank you. Greetings, everyone. Today I'm calling in from traditional territory of the Bokea people, or the Central Coast Pomo in Northern California. As an Indigenous Inde person, Apache, I am a guest in this Indigenous territory here and have been very privileged to work with tribal peoples in this region for, as Cecilia was saying, several decades, primarily on establishing tribal protected areas. Ihiehe, thank you, ILCN, and my colleagues on this panel for this opportunity for Indigenous land and ocean defenders to talk about our efforts. And I thank everyone today for your time and interest in learning from what we have to share. As Cecilia was mentioning, the Sinkyone Council, the full name Intertribal Sinkyone Wilderness Council, formed in 1986, a very unique tribal land and ocean protection organization comprised of 10 tribes. And this council has acquired and holds title to and stewards over 4,500 acres. That's approximately 1,384 hectares of land in Mendocino County, so-called Mendocino County. And this is within the traditional Sinkyone tribal territory. In partnership with Land Trust, the council was able to acquire these lands from private timberland owners, thereby protecting them from any future industrial harvesting, subdivision, any kind of development or destructive practices. The council's work is focused on initiatives to directly protect land and ocean, as well as advocacy, policy, and educational efforts. And I did have the honor of working with the council for 31 years until I retired from the position of executive director in December of 2021. Though I continue to work with the council as a consultant until the next director joins the council later this year. So I'm going to share some photographs with you here. And I hope we are now on the first slide. I trust that you have that up on the screen. I got into cultural landscape photography a while back in my travels to visit and work with various tribal nations. It's another way of storytelling to help explain tribal experiences and perspectives involved in regaining and healing traditional lands and waters. These photos are of tribal territories here in Northern California, along the coast primarily, as well as territories to the east through so-called Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah. I want to explore some concepts with you today to help us all open up our minds and hearts to important ideas and connections. Next slide. Indigenous lands and waters are sacred. They hold and reflect our identities. Often, they are places from whence we emerged. They hold the continuum of our existence through the generations and are where we find purpose, solace, healing. Next slide. Tribal and indigenous territories have been around for a long while in our understandings of the universe since the very beginning of time. Next. They encompass cultural landscapes. Next. Next. Cultural seascapes. Next. Next. And cultural celestialscapes. Next. Next. Indigenous peoples are the stewards of Earth's biocultural diversity and abundance. Comprising just 5% of the human population, Indigenous peoples manage 20 to 25% of the Earth's land surface in areas holding 80% of the planet's biodiversity and 40% of all terrestrial protected areas and ecologically intact landscapes. These figures are from the United Nations and from the World Bank. Next, 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 next. This should be the photograph with the elk. Indigenous agreements with nature involve a wide variety of relatives and relationships. Also, concepts and practices of reciprocity, all based on reverence for and the consent of nature. Next. Tribal nations. The existence of tribal rights and responsibilities is not determined by persons nor by institutions, but by the laws of nature and the tribe's existence and long-standing relationships with nature. Systems of indigenous law and governance long predate all subsequent laws and governance systems brought and imposed by colonist settlers and their institutions. Next. Indigenous laws are based upon the laws of nature, the movements and behaviors of the sun, earth, planets, stars, seasons, winds, rains, tides, plant and animal communities. Inherent to the laws of nature are spiritual forces. These principles and laws have been encoded into laws of indigenous societies for countless generations. We see that when the laws of nature and indigenous laws are adhered to, there is abundance and balance. When they are not, there is chaos and suffering. Next. Tribal nations' intergenerational reverence and care of nature ensures these legacies of biocultural diversity and abundance, ecosystem balance, and well-being. Next. Nature-based solutions like the so-called 30 by 30 initiatives can help protect and heal nature for the sake of present and future generations of all life, but such solutions require indigenous leadership to ensure success. Next. Indigenous peoples' motivations in such efforts are based upon their love of their traditional lands and waters and the many plant and animal relatives. The purpose of indigenous land protection and land back really is the healing of cultural landscapes and human communities, because these necessarily occur hand in hand. Next. Next. There is much good work yet to be done to help indigenous peoples return, reconnect with, revitalize, and heal our lands, waters, and communities. I thank you for listening and for your collaborations to support indigenous peoples in these crucial endeavors. Thank you.
Hawk, thank you so much. What truly inspiring reflections you've shared there. There are some questions coming through in the panel, and I encourage any more, please, to send them through in the Q&A. I might just kick off though with a big picture question, because it's clearly coming through in all of the reflections and language that our panelists have used today. And that's really around the idea of what we mean when we talk about conservation. We heard from Renee and Marissa that everything is connected. We heard from Lily that the Maori approach is to be that you are of the land and not on the land. And Hawke, used some really beautiful language around the idea that nature and conservation management is about reciprocity and reverence, and the idea actually of the consent of nature to work in and with it. So I suppose my question is, do we actually need to reframe what we mean and understand by conservation? Is that the starting point? Do we need a paradigm shift that actually explores our or integrates our oneness with nature? I'd be really interested in any of your thoughts on this idea.
If I may, this is Hawke. I will respond just very briefly to say that absolutely there is a reframing that is crucial, but that reframing must happen through the through a situation in which, or situations in which, Indigenous peoples are expressing these ideas and these principles on their own terms. And so this is a long kind of effort that will take, I think, a lot of diligence, a lot of communication, and a lot of willingness to give up preconceived notions. But absolutely that's needed, but it's something that, cannot be done by outsiders, that it has to be done by Indigenous peoples themselves. And so I guess the last thing I'll say related to that is that we need to lead these initiatives, these so-called conservation initiatives. We're not just stakeholders. We're not just participants. And for a long time, people have been saying, well, we want to invite Indigenous people to the table to be part of our efforts. And what many of us are now saying is that it's time that we set our own table and that we invite those to that table who are sincere allies, who can help us in the ways that we want their help and need their help. And in this way, we can build true collaboration, and we can then redefine these terms which are very outdated.
Thanks, Hawke. Marissa, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much, Hawke. That was just, amazing. You can't undo colonization. We kind of have to find a way to bridge the gap and coexist with the two sovereignties of the lands that that's occupying at the moment, and that's going to look like having that cross-cultural engagement and participation, but also, like was just said, that First Nations people leading this space and not just being a tick the box exercise and being a percentage on your deadly reconciliation action plan type of thing, actually, and not just having a voice, but also having real tangible outcomes and being actually self-determined in what affects Aboriginal people or First Nations people worldwide.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thanks, Marissa. And look, I'd also like to acknowledge the remark made by Lorena in the Q&A around the fact that it's the Chilean National Day of Indigenous Peoples, and the idea of the winter solstice being the time when you make a new beginning and celebrate the renewal of life. And I kind of like that as at a symbolic level in terms of how we're actually thinking about reframing and renewing how we think about some of these things. Underpinning that process is, another big theme coming through is this idea of relationships. And there's a lot going on in this space at the moment. There's almost a flurry. It's almost chaotic, but it's interesting, or it's challenging to think about how we meet that flurry. And I think that we need to be really careful not to rush, and be really careful to respect some of these relationships that we're talking about. We've got a great question from Jodie Gunn, the CEO of the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, who's asking here, what would you say are your top 3 criteria or values for building and maintaining meaningful relationships and enduring outcomes for country and community? Any reflections there?
Yes, if I may.
Thanks,
that's a wonderful question, and one that we get asked constantly in our line of work. In terms of my sort of 3 criteria or values that I think consist of solid partnerships, I would have to say representation, acknowledging that representation is necessary and impactful. It's meaningful at every level of every conversation. So not just consulting elders or spokespeople on behalf of the Indigenous group, but really involving Indigenous people in the decision making at a governance level to middle management, and then having that representation on the ground as well. I think Indigenous knowledge provides a grounded perspective. It provides historical context, and really does help propel these conservation and environmental movements. So representation is one. I think Hawke touched on reciprocity really well, and just having these equitable relationships which are beneficial to both sides. Quite often it can feel like, if I can say, it can feel like, box ticking. People, organisations wanting to engage in partnership that is beneficial to them, to be able to say, yep, we've done the things, we've spoken to the people of their land, and they've said that this is fine, that we push on ahead. But on the other side of that, there's no benefit to the Indigenous people, and it takes time and energy and trust to give, to share that knowledge and open space for these people. So I think it has to be equitable, it has to be beneficial on both sides. My last point that I think builds meaningful partnerships is consistency. It's not always easy partnering with Indigenous groups, Indigenous peoples. There are years and years of intergenerational trauma and intergenerational mistrust. Yep, we'll do that. Yep, absolutely. You can have access back to this. No, you can't. And then all of a sudden, the line's dead, and you kind of caught in the middle. So I think if at first you get met with a lot of shut doors, or if you're disheartened by what seems to be Indigenous people not wanting to engage, I think entering these spaces with an understanding of the historical context that comes before, and yes, the intergenerational trauma that has led to where we all are today, I think you're better equipped to keep trying and remaining consistent. I always say to our non-Indigenous partners, hang in there. It takes about a year of doing what you said you would when you said you would do it, and then on the other side of that, proving that you can do it in the way that you said that you would do it, and in the time frame that you promised, before that door will start to creak open fully. So consistency, that's representation, reciprocity, and consistency are my big 3. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. Marissa, do you have something you wanted to add?
I just really love what Lily said, and it just sums it up pretty perfectly. But also just free, prior, and informed consent, and guiding your engagement with that. Sometimes projects can look really deadly on paper and sound really great, but most of the time projects are written without engagement or consultation with First Nations people. So people, not policy, and nothing about us without us. So consent needs to be given, and yeah, like I just think like going out and actually having that genuine engagement, the way that Ben operates in his world, doesn't walk into a room thinking he knows everything. He's humble, and he's actually a real ally. As I said before, he nothing in this space is all about, it's not, removing the ego in the situation and actually trying to build over a number of years that relationship.
Thanks, Marissa. And I think that's right. I mean, it's, just because it is a growing priority, which is a really positive thing inside the conservation movement, we need to really make sure that that's genuine and authentic, and where the time is being taken to sort of really embed those relationships. A theme that came up.
Can I add one thought?
Of course, Hawk, please go ahead.
I believe it's really important for land trusts and environmental organizations to learn how to refrain from imposing your organizational agenda all the time. Remember that Indigenous timeframes, as the other speakers have just eloquently stated, those timeframes and the timeframes of nature also often do not align with white society's timelines and expectations. So in your work, factor in sufficient time for effective listening and learning, and take the effort to be deliberate and diligent and accountable. Because and in doing that, you must also work toward true equity and shared decision making, as was also emphasized. All those are important elements. They're essential to building effective collaborations and lasting relationships.
Thank you, Hawk. Yeah, absolutely. And that came up really strongly in our previous webinar around, how we build effective partnerships, and that effective listening and learning sounds like it's absolutely critical. We have a question from Chamatai in Uganda about how we help Indigenous people who were forcefully evicted from their ancestral land by governments and denied the ability to conserve those lands using Indigenous knowledge, how the conservation sector can perhaps address that or provide capacity around returning Indigenous peoples to the land.
Well, I think a lot of what we face in many Indigenous communities worldwide are a set of unique challenges on levels that are not experienced in other sectors of society. There are rampant, rates of poverty. The poverty levels are very high in most Indigenous communities, and the marginalization and the denial of rights and the opportunities. So before we can begin talking about, efforts, well-intended efforts to help, make sure that Indigenous peoples have a role in conservation, the more basic questions of how those communities that this participant just posed a question about, in places where they have been displaced from their lands, how are they actually living right now? What are their current day-to-day challenges and the quality of life? Because some people have a hard time meeting, their daily needs. So we have to look at those dynamics as part of this. We have to look at the economies within those communities and, the racism that is inherent to many of these places before we can begin looking at, how do we return land? Some of those basic human needs have to be understood and addressed. And so that's part of this work. That's why we always talk about equity and justice as well. That all is, in looking at those issues honestly and understanding and learning about them, then the work of land trust can help to advance these very laudable aspirations more effectively.
Excellent. Does anyone else have any reflections?
I mean, in an Australian context, you know, First Nations people being forcibly removed and put onto mission land, and the lasting intergenerational impacts of that, as I touched on in my introduction, you know, 16 foster placements, 5 years, you know, my mother was removed, her mother was removed. So the patterns of removal intergenerationally were, you know, it's evident. Auntie Mandy Nicholson, a Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung elder, wrote her thesis on connecting Aboriginal children to country, off country. So finding a way forward, you know, to do that, connecting to the land of which you've always kind of lived on, but also it's a really hard space because you're navigating, trying to learn and practice culture on a land that you don't have cultural authority on. So you can't undo it. You know, the state or, you know, the country that you're living in needs to repair that. There needs to be repatriation for that loss of it's cultural genocide. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe like by bringing children back onto country, you're sort of attempting to break some of those cycles, and that there might be a role for the conservation sector around that. I wonder, Ben, whether you've got any thoughts at this point, because you've been really leading the way in developing programs to get, you know, traditional owner, or, you know, Aboriginal persons back on country in different ways, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And also, there's a question, and I think it's related, from Ella around how we sort of reconcile the historically protectionist ethos of the Western conservation movement with Indigenous land management practices, and whether, you know, I mean, again, it's about reframing how we think about conservation, but really interested both in terms of the practical stuff that you've been doing on ground and your thoughts around some of those bigger issues.
Yeah, I think I very much see my role as to listen and act on behalf of the messages that come through from usually elders in our community, and more extended Aboriginal people. I think the words of all the panelists have been really clear in the sort of direction that we need to take. And it's funny the box ticking comment comes up, because I've actually started meetings with some traditional owner groups by saying, how can we not be a box ticker? What can we do to deliver what you want? Hawke's comments about not going in with your own agenda, I think that's where a lot of mistakes have been made in the past, because we'd come in with a full conservation project and say, do you consent to this? And there was really no room to do anything else. And it really was ingenuous in a sense for delivering conservation in partnership. And by changing that ethos and listening and acting and finding what that space is, even if you don't want it, even if it's not where you hoped it would go, but going in the direction where the First Nation knowledge is leading you, I've found through my own personal experience has been so much more rewarding and led to such better outcomes. Looking at practicing cultural burning, and being able to assist in enabling a cultural burn that hadn't happened for 160 years with one particular group was incredibly rewarding. And our role was largely administrative to set it up so that could happen. It was so nice to be part of it. And it was so nice to find the part that we could assist with, rather than taking ownership or trying to lead in a different direction. Just listening and learning from that's been so good. And working in that space where we have set up a training program for First Nations people, that's been designed by First Nation people and taught by elders, has been incredible. To watch over 7 years, different people go through the course and go into these amazing roles, go into positions of power and make change, has really changed the direction that we work, and taught us so much about how we should listen and how we should support in any way we can to get great conservation outcomes. Just 2 days ago, there's a new version of the course that we have that's specifically for school children. And I was out there with a Aboriginal woman who was teaching these children about the different plant uses, the foods. And as we moved away, we were able to see that these kids were taking on that knowledge and sharing it outside of that school space. And to think that she's been able to share that knowledge, and then it's getting passed on already to a younger generation that will hopefully have a special place for it in their mind somewhere, is really exciting. And so, yeah, I think this, if I were to sum it all up, I'd say listening, learning, and finding your place to help or support is the best place for a non-Indigenous person to be in.
Thank you, Ben. I actually wanted to ask a question that's a little more practical or technical. And that relates to, and it's been touched on a little bit, I think Marissa commented on it, but this idea of the permanent protection mechanism, so that, conservation organisations, land trusts across the world are using instruments like conservation easements, conservation covenants to protect natural values and increasingly cultural values and assets and practices as well. But I'm curious to know from the panel what your experience around this has been, whether you have views on whether those instruments are appropriate in the context of traditional ownership and management. And perhaps I'll start with you, because I know that you have worked in developing culturally focused conservation easements.
Yes, I have done this with the Sinkione Council, and it is a big challenge. And I think it's a challenge for us because, these systems of law and policy are entirely foreign to these Indigenous territories, but they have been imposed for a long time upon nature and our people. So, those same systems and in many cases, those same principles of law or doctrines, they first authorized genocide, and then they enabled domination and commodification of nature. And ultimately, if you just track it over time, these same laws and policies have led in many ways to the conservation crises we're now facing. So these bodies of today's conservation law are rooted in these colonial paradigms. And this concepts of owning and controlling nature, reducing its attributes to sets of values that are perceived in transactional terms. And so these are inherent challenges. And I think what we have to do is we have to take control over, our destiny through new processes that we innovate. I think because of the legal structures that we are faced with in many parts of the world, we have to navigate these things cleverly and, in ways that are very demanding. So this is where allies can come in to help us find solutions, different models that we can create. For example, here in the US, it's pretty much an assumption with many land trusts that there is this need for tribes to do what's called a limited waiver of sovereign immunity. So that is applied just for the purposes of enforcing the conservation easement. And it's the idea that the tribes waive their immunity from lawsuit, because sovereign nations have this inherent immunity from being able to be sued by other parties, generally. Very hard to do anyways. So with easements, the land trusts want a way to enforce that. And they're saying, well, and they often include that as a requirement. And now tribes are beginning to push back against that and say, we need different ways of ensuring, like, are there other instruments that are more appropriate? Are there covenants that we can enter into with you that are based upon our commitments and our long standing in these places? So that's what I'm very interested in, looking at those models and innovating new ways, new approaches in which we can create different instruments than what have been just used so prevalently for such a long time.
Yeah, thanks, Hawk. I mean, I think that's very live for us within our organisation, where, we've been using a conservation covenant without any cultural recognition built into it. So our first step is to think about how to do that. But then the step that follows that is, well, is this actually an appropriate instrument, in terms of securing land that's owned and managed by Indigenous peoples? So yeah, I really appreciate those reflections, and it feels like a very rapidly moving space. Was there anyone else who had practical sort of insights into that or wanted to say anything more? Well, otherwise, to be honest, I actually had a question for the audience, for those that might have any input to share. One of the themes that's emerged today is this idea of the importance of allies and the importance of building connections, both locally, but also nationally and globally. And this is something we've been exploring as part of this series, is how can we bring people together around this theme, potentially find platforms to share resources and knowledge and questions and so on. But we also don't want to reinvent the wheel. And if any of you joining us today rely on particular organisations, their websites, their resources, we'd really appreciate you sharing them in the chat. This is data that we're sort of collecting to decide what role the ILCN plays in facilitating some of those connections and the building of allegiances across the globe. So yeah, that was just something to drop in. We're getting close to the end now. Does anyone have any final reflections or thoughts that they would like to share?
Yes, sorry, I've got something quick. I've just been thinking about it and listening to Ben and Marissa and Hawk reflect on sort of ways that we can help Indigenous people get, in their journeys to get back on the land and in the conservation of Indigenous knowledge. I think, it can seem, well, it is a massive undertaking without legislation and policy and all of these supporting institutions to help further the goal that we're trying to get to. It can seem quite paralyzing in doing anything at all, but I do think that everyone has the capability to do something, and meeting people where you stand with the tools that are at your disposal is something that shouldn't be discounted. If you work in a bigger part of a conservation organisation or in the environmental field at all, and you feel sort of bound by the current legislation that's at play, you can still open a seat at your table to an Indigenous person. You can still provide opportunities for representation at that higher level, and work within your means to help further the Indigenous agenda. I also think leaving pride, guilt and traditional understandings of ownership at the door is really important. Having an understanding that land to Indigenous people has a social, cultural and spiritual function and value other than just an economic value, and that restoration means different things for different communities. You know, restoring through a Western sort of framework, restoring land means, okay, we'll plant a lot of trees, and then everything will be green, and that's fantastic. But that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing for Indigenous people. And I think, just stepping into these conversations and engaging with people, Indigenous people in these spaces, but coming to with that understanding that your idea of, at a very base level, restoration might not be the same to everyone in that conversation. I think that's that's all for me.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that, Lily, and it feels like such a great note to leave things on. You know, sometimes these problems can feel overwhelming, and it can be crippling, like you say. But we all have a role to play, and that can be big or small. And collectively, there's real potential for a shift here, and I'm quite excited about that. As we've heard today, you know, what's needed here is really deep thinking and reflection. You know, it needs to be genuine, and it needs to take the time that it takes. And yes, while the theme of today was around on-ground cultural land management approaches, I think what we're hearing is those approaches are entirely valid, but what's actually perhaps more important is to build the relationships over time, to welcome First Peoples onto country and reassess the ways that we think about conservation in order to drive some of those actions on ground. And I think, you know, that includes speaking to First Peoples about what conservation actually means to them, and embrace that blended approach to land management that's going to incorporate both Indigenous cultural knowledge as well as, you know, Western science-based approaches. And that attitude, as you say, Lily, that land has social, cultural, and spiritual value. It's not a transaction, and it's not a wilderness area that gets set aside that has no humans in it. It's something different, and I think it's an exciting time to be in the conservation space as we grapple with some of these challenges, but also these opportunities. So a really big thank you to our wonderful panelists and to our audience. Thank you so much for sharing in this conversation. I really look forward to taking that conversation forward.
I'll just add, from the ILCN's point of view, we're honored to have you with us today. You brought up a lot of really interesting points. And I think that, you know, the only way that humanity is going to get through climate change and the crises that we face right now is to link arms and work together to protect Mother Earth. So thank you so much for your wisdom and your time. We are most appreciative.